Modern biblical exegesis faces a central challenge. Readers often approach the Bible as a collection of competing historical documents, rather than a singular, unified text. This creates a division between event and text. Isolating historical artifacts strips them of the theological meaning their authors intended to convey. Historical criticism often dissects these texts into separate source documents. However, this approach ignores the final canonical shape, the specific way the authors and editors intentionally organize the completed whole. Stopping at historical analysis results in descriptive theology, which merely catalogs what ancient authors believed. We must pursue prescriptive theology, which determines the actual demands the text places on the reader today. Academic studies frequently isolate these documents to argue that the Bible contains multiple contradictory theologies. A rigorous reading requires pursuing a singular, cohesive theology across the canon.
The corrective framework for this fragmentation is biblical theology. This is the discipline of analyzing how the entire biblical canon progresses, integrates, and climaxes in Christ on its own terms. Achieving this organic synthesis means we cannot interpret a passage in a vacuum. We must plot any given text along two intersecting planes simultaneously. The first plane is the salvation historical axis. This tracks the chronological progression of God's redemptive plan over time. The second plane is the literary canonical axis. This tracks how the biblical texts themselves are structurally and legally organized to interpret that history. Determining what a specific passage means requires locating its exact coordinate on this dual-axis matrix. That location reveals its precise relationship to the Christological fulcrum. The salvation historical axis operates on the premise that the Bible's chronological events are not random occurrences. They form a deliberate, organic timeline. We can map this redemptive history using the kingdom matrix. This chart represents the distinct epochs of the covenant timeline. The K epoch maps creation, the fall, and the flood. This establishes the initial baseline of God's relationship with the world, moving from original design to fracture. The I and N epochs represent the patriarchs, followed by the Exodus, Sinai, and the wilderness. These columns track the formation of a specific people and the formal giving of the law. Next are the G and D epochs, conquest and kingdoms, followed by exile and initial restoration. These trace the establishment of a physical nation and the subsequent breaking of that national covenant. Together, these 5 epochs from Genesis to the return from Babylon form the complete Old Testament foundation. These foundational epochs connect to the future through specific mechanisms: thematic development, direct promise and fulfillment, and typology, where earlier historical figures or events serve as types that prefigure later realities. That brings us to the New Testament fulfillment, beginning with the O epoch, Christ's work and the church age. Finally, the M epoch maps Christ's return and kingdom consummation, returning to the visual symmetry of the restored tree. This salvation historical map demonstrates that the biblical narrative tracks a single, continuous trajectory from the Edenic foundation to the final consummation of the kingdom. Chronological mapping is insufficient on its own. We must cross-reference it with the literary canonical axis. The structural form and arrangement of the canon dictates how we must interpret the history it records.
The Old Testament is organized around a specific tripartite covenantal structure. It begins with the covenant established in the law, moves to the covenant enforced in the prophets, and concludes with the covenant enjoyed in the writings. Within this architecture, a distinct pattern emerges. Each of the 3 sections opens with foundational historical narratives: the law, the former prophets, and the former writings. Those narratives are followed by commentary texts, the latter prophets and latter writings. The commentary explains the theological weight of the preceding narratives. The New Testament perfectly mirrors this exact tripartite covenantal structure. The Gospels and Acts map to the covenant established. The Pauline and general epistles map to the covenant enforced, and Revelation maps to the covenant enjoyed. It also repeats the internal sequence. The historical narratives of the Gospels and Acts are immediately followed by the apostolic commentary of the epistles. The physical arrangement of the canon is a deliberate framework. It forces the reader to interpret historical narratives through the lens of the prophetic and apostolic commentary attached to them. When we overlay the chronological timeline with this canonical structure, a technical question arises. By what exact mechanism do we integrate the two without violating the Old Testament's original context? The New Testament does not merely append new information. It provides both the final synthesis and the interpretive algorithm for reading the Old Testament matrix. Biblical theologian G.K. Beale identifies the specific presuppositions, the interpretive code, that the New Testament authors use to process Old Testament data. First is the assumption of corporate solidarity. This is an ancient concept where one individual can rightfully and completely represent the many. Second, the authors view the Messiah as representing the true, faithful remnant of the Old Covenant and the consummate Israel of the New Covenant. Third is the conviction that history is unified by a sovereign plan. The earlier events are structurally designed to correspond to and clarify the latter events. Fourth is the certainty that the age of eschatological fulfillment, the final climactic era of the biblical timeline, has arrived in the person of Christ. Without this specific algorithm running in the background, the Old Testament matrix remains a collection of disjointed data. With it, the typological promises and covenantal continuities align into a singular, cohesive narrative. Christ serves as the center of history and the essential interpretive framework for every portion of both the Old and New Testaments. Applying the algorithm, we see how New Testament fulfillment maps backward onto the Old Testament foundation. The consummation tree in Revelation resolves the narrative tension of the Edenic tree in Genesis. The cross directly answers the sacrificial lamb of the Exodus. Christ brings the climax to redemptive history because he is the precise fulfillment of both the structural law and the subsequent prophetic commentary. He is the necessary lens through which any application of the Old Testament must pass. This moves our study beyond asking what is the frame or how is it formed. We must answer why is this focus here, and ultimately, to whom does this point? To faithfully ask what does this passage mean is to ask where it sits on the salvation, historical, and literary canonical matrix, and how it directly anticipates, integrates with, or climaxes in the mission of Christ.